There's a myth about Russia that I've been hearing for a very long time, and it's an aspect of the overall myth of Russian invincibility. The idea that Russia is an undefeatable nation, that Russian people are so resilient, so strong in the face of hardship, that nothing could ever be bad enough for them to actually quit, or actually surrender, or actually demand changes. And the aspect of this myth that I want to explore today is something that's repeated a lot when people say that Ukrainian strikes can never actually be successful in breaking the will of the Russian people, or making the Russian people frustrated enough to actually demand changes from their own government. This conversation is very important to have today, because currently Ukraine is actively striking Russian infrastructure targets, primarily energy targets, but also other sorts of targets, trying to make the Russian people actually feel the weight of the war in a way they never have before. Right now, there are massive gasoline shortages throughout Russia, and some people are having to wait in line for up to 8 hours just to get a 2-liter ration of gasoline. There are other problems across Russia. There are problems with air transit as Russian airports are constantly being shut down. And Russia is about to enter the winter where they are having massive energy shortages already, which could create severe problems. What we need to examine, though, is if there's even a point to all of this. Can these types of attacks actually be successful? Can Ukraine successfully change the minds of the Russian people and turn their attitude away from supporting the war and towards demanding an end to the war? On the surface, you would think the answers to these questions would be obvious, especially when you consider the scale of the carnage that Ukraine is able to inflict upon the Russian economy, the fact that that carnage is being sustained for a long period of time, and the fact that that carnage is getting worse, not getting better. Even in Western societies, in response to very minor things, like minor rises in gas prices or minor rises in egg prices, you will often see people emotionally demanding immediate political change. And my point is not to say that all of those things are completely irrelevant, but when you consider the scale of those things and how much they impact people's lives compared to the scale of things that people in Russia are experiencing, it would seem obvious that any human being would have a strong reaction to this kind of pressure. However, in Russia's case, people will plead to social differences, and they will actually do something that is called special pleading, where they will argue that Russia's case is special, that Russia is not subject to the same economic rules or the same psychological rules that apply to everybody else, because Russia has such a history of hardship that these things just don't apply. However, as you'll see in this video, that understanding of Russian society is completely wrong. And we can know it's completely wrong for several reasons. First of all, because the Russian government has done everything they can to make the Russian people feel like they are not actually undergoing hardship, or if they are, that it's much worse in other countries. And second of all, we can know that it's not true because all of these conclusions are based on a very selective understanding of Russian history. A lot of people make the mistake of looking at Russian history and pointing out the hardships, but neglecting to point out the revolutions that came in response to those hardships. For example, people will point out that the Russians lived under the Tsars, who were just absolutely brutal. And they'll say, well, they're used to living under the Tsars, they will tolerate just about anything. And they'll also say, well, the Russians lived under the Soviet Union, and they experienced so many terrible aspects of the Soviet Union. We're talking about gulags, famines, disease, political repression, and things of that sort. And they'll say, because the Russians have this in their history, what they experience under Vladimir Putin is nothing in comparison. And so why would we ever believe the Russians would actually stand up? However, the actual reality is that there is a pattern to Russian history. And Vladimir Putin has very much been responding to this pattern, and he's very much afraid of it. And this pattern is that the peasantry does not tolerate abuses from their government forever. The peasantry has demonstrated several times in Russian history that they are willing to rise up and demand changes. They are willing to overthrow leaders, and they are willing to commit to social changes when things don't go their way. We see this because the Russian Empire collapsed, and the Soviet Union, in fact, collapsed, and that went in several stages. First, the Soviet Union demanded changes from the Stalinist era of purges and stuff like that. And they demanded a better society, and even that was not enough. The Soviet Union ultimately disintegrated largely because of internal economic pressure, because the people were frustrated with what their government was doing, and all of the individual republics decided to go their separate ways because they no longer believed in the Soviet system. So the idea that people within the Russian or the Soviet sphere of the world simply never rise up and overthrow their governments is completely historically false. Now, nobody is more aware of the fact that this myth is false than the Russians themselves and also the Ukrainians. And that explains a lot of what we have seen from both Russia and Ukraine throughout the war. Ukraine is attacking Russia's economy, not because they don't think it will ever work, but because as a post-Soviet country themselves, they understand exactly what it feels like to be a citizen under a repressive government. And they understand exactly what it takes to get those citizens to finally stand up, revolt, and demand independence or demand changes. They themselves, again, have done that. And Russia, for their part, also completely understands that this is a massive possibility. And this is why they have sought to control their society the way they do. As we all know, as soon as the war in Ukraine started, millions of Russian citizens fled their own country. And this is the exact opposite of a people who will just lie down and take anything that their government is going to dish at them. These people fled their country for the exact reason that they knew pain was coming and they actively wanted to avoid it. And at that time, leaving the country was the path of least resistance to get that. That has since gotten harder because Russia actively patrols their borders to prevent young men from leaving. But it remains the same psychology, although the path of least resistance has now potentially changed. We've also seen Russia respond to people wanting to take the path of least resistance in several ways. Russia has cracked down on free speech since they started the war in Ukraine, so that people cannot talk against the war, or what they call the special military operation. This isn't just denial, it is an attempt by Russia to control the thinking of the populace. They know they cannot control the entire populace, but they want to control enough of them to prevent a critical mass from forming that could actually come out in opposition against what they're doing. And this is not something that governments do because they are so convinced that people will just lie down and take whatever they dish. This is something that governments do because they are terrified that the people will actually do exactly the opposite of that. There are so many other examples that we could cite that show that far from having an attitude of bravado and fearlessness when it comes to his own citizens, Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin regime in general are actually very paranoid of their own people. We see this at a high level just in the fact that Russia has so much internal propaganda trying to influence the way its people think, because they know they have to do that. They have to try to win the people over to their side if possible, because if the people are against them, they can indeed demand and they can indeed make changes. We also see very clear examples of this in the paranoia that is implicit, actually probably explicit, whenever a Russian elite falls out of a window or meets their end in another way. Because you don't just send elites to their death for no reason. You send elites to their death because you are terrified that they know too much. They have too much power, and they can potentially accumulate resources or people to themselves to challenge you in some way. And to ensure that that never happens, you take those elites out, not just to take them out, but also to threaten the other elites. Again, it is not exactly a show of, I don't think I could ever be overthrown. It actually implies you're paranoid of that exact result. And we also see this very clearly in the way that Vladimir Putin has approached filling the Russian military, even for the war against Ukraine, where the last thing that he has been willing to rely on is patriotism. Very notably, very explicitly, Vladimir Putin has not relied on conscription or mobilization to force young Russian men to go to the front lines against their will. Instead, he has focused on tactics of deceiving people to go to the front lines, usually through large military paychecks, and they might tell them that they're going to rear areas and then send them to the front lines. But they are very unwilling to grab Russian men off the streets and put them on the front lines. And this is because they know better than we do that if they were to do this, the fabric of Russian society could unravel far quicker than we might even imagine. So instead, they have resorted to bribing people with large paychecks, not just to get them to go voluntarily and to reduce a lot of the effect, because a lot of Russians will say, well, they had it coming to them because they got paid a lot of money for it. But they also do this to put a lot of money into the Russian society so that the Russian people artificially feel like things are going better than they actually are. There are constant surveys that show a large portion of Russians still support the war, which are hard to believe for a lot of reasons. Number one, because if you said anything else, who knows what the government would do to you. But to the extent that these surveys are legitimate, and to a large degree they probably are, there are a lot of Russians who want to support the war and think it's a good thing. That's because the Russians have been tricked into thinking that the war has been good for them economically. It's very similar to how in the United States, a lot of people, kind of jokingly in reference to World War II, will say, you know what we really need for our economy is another war. Because during World War II, things were just so good and it kind of brought us out of the Depression and things like that. They didn't realize that things weren't actually that good. The only reason our economy boomed after World War II was because every other major economy on Earth was devastated by fire bombings and things like that. And so we had a monopoly on manufacturing for quite a while, and that caused us to rise to the top. That sidebar aside, it's similar with the Russian economy and the war in Ukraine. Russia has worked to create an artificial sense of prosperity around this war that most of the Russian people are not connecting the dots on. They think somehow that their GDP has grown, even though their country has been heavily sanctioned. Therefore, they have lost the majority of their revenue through oil and gas. And even if you believe oil and gas revenues are doing better than a lot of people say, it would be crazy to argue that Russia is actually doing better with less revenue than they had prior to the war. Nevertheless, a lot of Russians believe this because through military spending, Vladimir Putin has put a lot of money into the Russian economy that he saved up over a very long period of time prior to the war. And he has also funded the war through inflation, a mechanism that most Russians don't understand, which causes the economics to become terrible, but people might temporarily feel rather rich. And all of this is an attempt to, rather than making the Russian people feel the cost of the war, make the Russian people feel like the war is actually improving their lives. Because Vladimir Putin knows that if the Russian people feel the cost of the war, they will almost certainly turn against him. All of this, though, is a very big problem for Vladimir Putin today. Because the problem with artificial perceptions is you can only keep them up for so long. And if you don't achieve the goal of the artificial perception, and you're not able to convert the artificial perception into a real, durable advantage, everything will eventually fall out from under your feet. And that is what Russia is now facing today. Russia is facing a crisis on every front, on a military front, but primarily on an economic front. And they're facing that crisis for several reasons. They're facing it because the savings account that they built up to get them this far has largely, if not completely, run out, and it is only being sustained by massive inflation. But they are also in an economic crisis because of the pressure of Ukraine, who I already mentioned at the beginning of this video, has been intentionally ramping up their strikes on the Russian economy, on Russian infrastructure, particularly oil and gas targets, to make the average Russian person feel the effects of the war in a way that they never have before. The timing of that might not be a coincidence. Due to all of this, Vladimir Putin seems to realize that it is going to be increasingly difficult for him to keep the Russian people on his side, and therefore to keep his power and potentially even to keep his own life. And because of that, we have seen a whole lot of changes in Vladimir Putin and his tactics domestically over the past year or so, but especially ramping up over the past several months. We have seen, for example, and I've talked about it in other videos on this channel, a lot of discussions of purges within the Russian military, a lot of discussions of potential coups, which I have argued are an attempt by Vladimir Putin to kind of root out disloyal elements because these discussions have been so public. And all of this looks like an effort for Vladimir Putin to try to get control of the elites in a way that he has never had to, at least up to this point in the war. Up to this point in the war, of course, he has had people falling out of windows and things like that, but we have never seen anything this explicit that looks this desperate and shows this much fear in Vladimir Putin. We have also seen Vladimir Putin have to go to his people and basically make concessions about the war in Ukraine to his people, at least publicly. Who knows if he will actually make those concessions, but he definitely felt compelled to promise them. In particular, he felt compelled to promise his people that the Russian military budget would be lowered next year, which implies a lot of things. First of all, the economy is a real problem, despite what Russia says. Second of all, the Russian people know that the economy is a problem, and they know that it's because of the war. And third of all, Vladimir Putin fears that pushback enough that he felt compelled to throw them a bone. Vladimir Putin knows that the Russian people will only tolerate so much. Unlike a lot of Western commentators, Vladimir Putin knows that his current country is a post-revolutionary state, and that they have actually gone through several revolutions. He knows that when things start to impact people in a real way, people respond to that. And that response might look different than we expect in Western countries. It might seem to come a little slower, but that's because the Russian people are starting from a lower baseline. And so it is harder to hit them hard enough to where they feel the impact in a more real way. But once they feel that impact in a real way, they respond to that impact. The same way we here in America respond to the impact of gas prices or rising egg prices, Russian people are people too. And when they have impacts that finally reach them directly, that's when things can hit the fan. Putin has again been trying to push this off through artificial means as long as he could. I mentioned the military paychecks, which were largely stimulus for the Russian economy. Vladimir Putin has also been printing a lot of money to fund subsidization of commodity prices within Russia, to try to keep food prices low and to try to keep energy prices low, to try to keep the costs of all of the basics that the average Russian person actually buys as low as possible. The Russian people don't realize that these prices are actually rapidly increasing. They're just increasing in the form of currency depreciation rather than actual price tags, although sometimes even still they are increasing in terms of actual price tags too. All these artificial means, though, have a hard limit, and that hard limit is now being approached. The problem that Putin faces is immense, because the moment the charade can no longer be kept up, as we see currently today with rising gas prices, the Russian people don't have a whole lot of margin to work with. Once the Russian people start to feel a real impact on their actual budgets, most of them do not have enough spending money left over after expenses to get anything. They are used to that low level of spending money, but because it is so low, it can also go away rather quickly. So as soon as we see food prices increase, or energy prices increase, or food prices increase because energy prices have increased, or any other number of things, that will very quickly thin out Russian budgets to the point that is no longer sustainable. That then will cause the Russian people to actually feel the impact of the war for the first time in a way they haven't felt it before. And there is no amount of money the Russian government can print today to make up for that. They've already printed basically all that they can print. Just for example, in some statistics that I found, which are always directionally correct but never precisely accurate, in poorer regions of Russia, the average monthly income is equivalent to only about $400. That is a very low income, not a lot of margin in it. And under current conditions, Russians use about 45% of that income to buy food, so about $180. They will then use approximately $50 to $60 a month on heat, $50 to $60 a month on fuel in terms of gasoline, and they will spend an additional maybe $40 to $60 on rent. And when you add all of those things up, you find that the average Russian in a poorer region of Russia might only have $50 to $100 of their income left to work with. This is a major problem because in recent days, literally this month, it's not yet reflected in the data, but we have seen gas prices in some regions of Russia increase from around $2.40 to prices that are approaching $3.80, approaching $4. That is a huge increase. And it's not only a direct increase when people buy gasoline, but it also increases the cost for everything else they buy. That increase alone in those regions can eat up all of the tiny margin that the Russians living in those regions had. And that will quickly cause their lifestyle to change drastically. Because when you go from being able to buy a few luxuries to being able to buy zero luxuries, that is a much bigger difference than, for example, in America, when we go from being able to buy a huge number of luxuries to a somewhat smaller selection of luxuries. Now, $50 to $100 of spending money a month is a very small margin. Not all of Russia has the same margins. For example, in Moscow, people make a lot more money per month, but the costs are also a little higher. They also have thin margins. Their margins are more in the hundreds of dollars per month, not in the tens of dollars per month. But those margins are still small enough that relatively small impacts into the Russian economy can have a major impact on people's lifestyles. And that is really what needs to be measured when it comes to Russian people's resilience. You need to measure things Not in dollar amounts, but you need to actually measure things in hard impacts on people's lifestyle. This is what a lot of people don't realize. Russia has been working very hard throughout the entire war to make sure that Russian lifestyles don't experience a large impact. And they've been able to do this through a large number of economic tricks because the Russian baseline is so low. It doesn't require a ton of money to keep the average Russian's lifestyle consistent with what they've always experienced. Russia, though, is now running out of these economic tricks. The average Russian will now start to feel not just a financial difference, but they will start to feel a lifestyle difference. And when you start measuring things in terms of how long does it take me to get a liter of gasoline that lasts me like 5 minutes, it takes me 8 hours to get 5 minutes worth of gasoline, then you start to realize the serious impacts that could actually cause the Russian people to start demanding some changes. It is within this context that Ukraine is continuing to ramp up the pressure on the Russian economy through long-range strikes, and where they have also just recently introduced long-range strike capabilities, the Flamingo missile, which can take out more targets directly, but also spread Russian air defenses more thinly, meaning that Ukraine will do an incrementally and exponentially better job at damaging the Russian economy. Not only this, while this is happening, Russia is now entering into the winter months, which is also going to make things worse in and of itself. And you can see how bad things can really become. Now, in my videos, I never really give a sense of timing, and that's intentional, because I don't know the timing. I can only see how things are directionally going, and we'll see how things play out logically over time, but we will never know exactly what time the climax might come, and some big event might come. But as you can see, directionally, everything lines up. Things are looking really bad for Russia. Things are looking really bad for the Russian economy, and therefore things are looking really bad for Vladimir Putin. And this is in a country that has experienced not just one revolution, but several major revolutions within the last century. Things really could change. We need to stop believing in the myth of Russian invincibility. We need to remember that Russian people are people too. That matters from every perspective possible, including their ability to stand up to immense pressure. If you watch this far into the video, I hope it's not presumptuous to say that you probably got something of value out of it. Maybe you heard new information. Maybe you heard dots connected in a way that you hadn't heard them connected before. Maybe you heard things explained in a way that made everything finally click. Whatever the reason, if you got something of value from this video, would you please support this channel by liking the video and subscribing to the channel? It's completely free and it only takes a second. And if you want to support this channel even more, there's a number of ways you can do so in the description of the video. You can become a patron or a YouTube channel member. I really appreciate all of my supporters. You guys really do make it possible for me to focus my energy on researching, filming, and editing and posting videos, which takes a lot of work, but all of my supporters are now allowing me to do that much more frequently and much more quickly. So thank you for all you do. It's making an impact on my life, and I hope in return I'm able to make an impact on your life and on other lives.